of members opposite.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the limited time we have, I don't want to devote too much time to responding to the previous speaker, although a speaker with whom I have considerable respect, not least in climate change issues. But notwithstanding that, it isn't too hard to refute each of the points he made. Firstly, he commented on the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from 2002 to 2008 and the reduction in emissions from 2009 to 12, as if that was a badge of honour for the government. It was nothing of the sort. It had to do with the global financial crisis. It does. The gross emissions reduced. That's one aspect, but the fact is that the gross emissions went down largely because, you're talking about net, the gross emissions went down largely because of the GFC, and they will if in fact there is economic growth again, and if you do not decouple, then those gross emissions are going to rise again. And what Dr. Smith didn't do was point out figure 2.1 of the review panel's report, to the effect that both gross emissions, Mr. Chair, gross emissions are going to rise. He didn't point that out. Whichever government is in power, unless there is a strong ETS in place, gross emissions are going to rise. And I do not see him to receive the point. In fact, he asked for the government to be commended for the gross emissions going down. Well, if that's the case, the government has to be commended for the emissions going down because of the GFC only. The Guardian, his second point, The Guardian, and that New Zealand lamb is less of a carbon footprint than British. That is true as far as it goes. What he didn't say is that in either case, our agricultural emissions are going up as a result of increased meat production to meet increased global population. So unless you can decouple agriculture from an increase in gross emissions, we in this country, whether we are less carbon intensive than Britain or not, are going to be responsible for an increase in emissions. And we cannot afford to do that, and neither can the world. So point 3, manufacturing jobs. You cannot have it both ways. True, you cannot. And you don't have to. The Green Party put out a platform in 2011, only a year ago, for 100,000 new green jobs that reduce emissions and increase the quality of life with employment going up. So it's easy enough to do. It's just that we don't get hung up on the old-fashioned notion of how to get jobs. Number 4, electricity prices. You need a balance. Totally agree with that. It's just that you get a balance by some recycling of revenue that can be obtained through either an ETS or a carbon tax, and it doesn't have to be in the way that Dr. Smith is implying. And finally, he is criticising the opposition for critiquing the ETS as going backwards and that was untrue. Well, he's right there. It is not going backwards. It's going forwards. It's going forwards to dangerous climate change and potentially catastrophic. Nothing is going backwards. Nothing can go backwards, at least not in this universe, although there may be one or two parallel ones in the chamber. But the fact is that we cannot afford to have the kind of emissions trading scheme that is in front of us, that is being further weakened, if we want to have regard for what is going on around the planet. Mr. Banks looks at me as if he's wondering what is happening in the Arctic. Well, the fact is that polar ice has melted 80% since 1980 and is on course to be ice-free for one day in 2015. That's 50 years ahead of 2065, which was the scientific... We'll get to that. Yep, patience, and we get there. You can only adopt an ETS that is going to be strong enough to meet the requirements coming from the science. And that is the premise on which the Green SOP is based, number 147. And it's a rather broad-ranging ETS which seeks to strengthen all the provisions that have been weakened in the ETS in the last 3 years and a half. So the departure point for the green, let us call it the Green Emissions Trading Scheme, is that we look to the purpose of the Climate Change Response Act 2002, which is to enable New Zealand to meet its international obligations under the Convention and the Protocol. That is not just the Kyoto Protocol, sir. that is the Framework Convention as well, which goes beyond the Kyoto Protocol. So we have to, Mr. Chair.
Dr. Graham.
We have to meet the requirements of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions post-2012 under the Framework Convention. That is an obligation. How do we do it? And how do we do it in a way that meets the science that is coming out, sir? The science suggests, it makes it clear, there is a range on countries such as ours to reduce by 25 to 40% by 2020 and 80 to 95% by 2050. Now, I note in the Cabinet paper that the government has the impudence to say it doesn't follow that New Zealand or any country has to be within that range, which I suggest is a logical absurdity and morally irresponsible, because that range is determined by the scientists. All Annex I countries are meant to be in that range. Okay, so if we proceed from that, we can then turn to the targets as they are set out in Part 1 of Schedule 5. And here are the figures, which I have never seen come out from the government, incidentally, although they are there more or less in the review panel's report as to the tonnages that meant to come down. Now, we can either say it's too damn hard and we'll rip it up and throw it into the waste paper basket and look forward to potentially catastrophic climate change, or we can say, my God, this is going to be difficult and let's work together to work out how we do it. And I'm prepared to do that. I don't think for a second that we've got all the answers, but this is the figures. These are the figures that would be required. Okay. Yep, I understand the question. Thanks for that. We'll get there. So if you then proceed to Part 2, you will find there are 5 yearly carbon budgets, as in the British model, as to how we get there. They reflect the figures that are in Part 1. Now, if national MPs and Green MPs look to that, we would be able to at least have an informed dialogue as to how to get there. How do we get there? We get there by setting up an independent commission on climate change to give independent advice to the government, whether it's national, Labour, Green, as to what figures are meant to go into the carbon budgets to get down to virtually a carbon-free economy by 2050. We would set up an appeals tribunal to receive any pleas for financial relief from any sector, whether it is corporate, farming or household or individuals that believe that they are experiencing undue financial hardship as a result of a strengthened ETS. Let us not gloss over the fact that there will be change and uncomfortable change as a result of the need to adapt to a low-carbon economy. The challenge is not to deny it. The challenge is to work our way together as to how you get through it. I do take the points about the shock therapy of an apparent carbon tax. The measures would be an introduction of a price floor and a termination of the price cap, a phase-out of the 1-for-2 surrender obligation, termination of the issuance of free allocations to participants, introduction of auctioning under the General's discretion of the Minister, commencing in 2013, restrictions on international units that can be traded and surrendered in New Zealand to the tune of 30%, introduction of agriculture into the scheme in 2014, which was originally intended to be 2013, and a requirement on ETS participants who are purchasing units under the scheme to purchase a minimum percentage of those units in the form of units held by participants in the Permanent Forest Sink Initiative. The foresters have had it bad. PFSI foresters are only part of that, but they probably are getting a worse deal than anybody. So there is a huge need to look at each of these provisions, and I put it forward to the House with respect to the Minister to engage in a proper dialogue, respectful mutual dialogue on each of these provisions, because while I will receive sincerely a critique of these provisions from the government, which no doubt will be on the grounds that it is too difficult and will incur too much short-term financial pain, the answer to each of those is to the Minister and the government and to national MPs, all colleagues in this House, because we're in it together, let's face it. Can you show to our satisfaction a weaker scheme that is going to meet the demands of the science that is coming out in the last 3 years since the 2007 IPCC report pertaining to ice melt, potential methane release, and the impacts of climate change that are around us. Thank you.
Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.